Introduction. Pats. The first time I met Mark Garagos was when I went to his office to fire him. At the time, I was engaged to Susan McDougall, the woman who was sitting in a jail cell in Los Angeles because she refused to talk to Kenneth Starr's Whitewater jury. She also had a pending case in Los Angeles involving fake accusations of embezzling from a former employer. Before she was transferred to Los Angeles, I had been working as a public defender for 2 years in Nashville, Tennessee. But after she moved to LA, I quit my job to move there and work on the case. Since I had no California bar license, my first order of business was to find a California lawyer who was willing to take the case. This was not an easy task, because we had no money and we were essentially asking a lawyer to do the case pro bono. When I arrived in LA, I made contact with the named lawyers, Vincent Bugliosi, Leslie Abramson, Johnny Cochran, but I could not drum up any interest. Over the next few weeks, I met with at least 10 lawyers, pleading with them to take the case and telling them that the media coverage would help their careers. Nobody was buying it. Then one Sunday, Susan made her nightly call from jail. She sounded a little sheepish, which was very un-Susan-like, and I could tell that something had happened that she was nervous talking about. Finally, she blurted it out. "I think I hired a lawyer." "You what? What do you mean you think you hired a lawyer?" "Well, I signed a retainer with this guy." "Oh my Lord, Susan, why would you sign a retainer with some guy that I haven't even spoken to or done any research on?" "I liked his shoes." "That's why? You hired a lawyer because you liked his shoes?" "I also liked his briefcase. He just gives off the appearance of being very successful." "What is the guy's name?" "Mark Garagos." "I've never heard of him. You can't sign a retainer because you liked his shoes and briefcase. You realize that I'm going to have to go see this guy and fire him." The next day, my brother, Ron Harris, who was in town visiting, and I drove to downtown Los Angeles and walked into Mark's office unannounced. I didn't want him preparing for what was coming. When we were ushered into his office, he was very gracious and polite, and seemed somewhat amused that we were there. More than that, he had a plan, and he knew exactly how he was not only going to help Susan on the LA case, but he was going to help her fight Starr in the Office of Independent Counsel. His father, who was also his law partner, was an old-time Roosevelt Democrat, and he had approached Mark about representing Susan, even though he knew that it could cost the firm a lot of money. His father had told him that, if that little girl can stand up to Starr, then the least we can do is stand up for her. When we left the office, I was too dazed to speak. Not only was his demeanor impressive, but this was a lawyer who was extremely enthusiastic about representing Susan. I looked at Ron and asked him if it was possible that we had really gotten lucky enough to stumble into a lawyer this good. The answer turned out to be yes. Not only did I not fire him, within a month he hired me to work at the firm, where I have now been for 15 years. He won Susan's case in Los Angeles, and then we went to Arkansas, where we whipped Starr in the Office of Independent Counsel in a trial there. Oddly enough, Susan and I split up, but Mark and I stayed together. Unlike Mark, I always planned on being a lawyer. My grandfather, George Patterson, was a lawyer and later a judge in the small town of Clarksville, Arkansas. He died when I was only 3, but I grew up having people stop me on the street to tell me stories about how he had represented them for free or for a bushel of corn because they had no money. My mother would tell us how widely respected he was, about the large number of people he had helped. He was a real-life Atticus Finch, at least in the mind of an impressionable young boy. My brother, Ron, and my sister, Cheryl, also had the same experience, and they became lawyers too. My route to law school was a little more circuitous than most students, as I worked in politics, entertainment, real estate, restaurants, baseball, and taxi driving before I made it to law school at the age of 31. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, I just wasn't in any hurry. Unlike a lot of my law school classmates, I didn't love law. I wasn't interested in analyzing an appellate court decision on some obscure antitrust statute from 1931 as an academic exercise. What I was interested in doing was getting into a courtroom, and law school was the necessary evil to get me there. Other than a brief fling with the First Amendment law, my only real law school relationship was with criminal law in the classes that pertain to evidence and criminal procedure. My confidence in my future courtroom abilities bordered on cockiness. I had always done a lot of public speaking, beginning at the age of 16 when I preached a sermon at my church. My confidence took a hit. However, at an oral argument competition during my second year of law school at the University of Michigan, each stories of murderers being released on technicalities and criminals being given short sentences became standard fodder in many campaigns. The idea that the system had gone soft on crime was totally absurd and untrue, but remarkably effective. The truth was that from 1968 until 1992, a span of 24 years, with the exception of the 4-year Carter presidency, the Supreme Court and federal courts have been filled with Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Bush appointees who were conservative, pro-police, and victims' rights oriented. By 1992, when the soft on crime campaigns were in full swing, the courts were actually tougher on crime than at any time in the past century. The pendulum has swung so far at this point that Mark and I agreed we needed to make the time to write this book. Thus, it ended up being written with a twofold purpose. One reason was still to give the reader a look at how the system operates, completed with stories of oversexed jurors, lying witnesses, and clients who want to bribe the judges. The other purpose was to provide a sense of how the system has lost its balance, resulting in overcrowded jails, frightened judges, and prosecutors with a Batman complex. This book is not a legal treaty, nor does it require legal decree or some legal expertise to understand it. The first thing we realized was that a serious critique of the legal system, complete with tables, charts, and statistics, would be enjoyed by only the 12 people who would read it. This book is meant to be more of a fun look at the system that rarely lets you see behind the scenes. At the same time, it is our fervent hope that some of the stories will generate debate over such issues as confessions, eyewitness identifications, and media coverage of high-profile trials. It is also our hope that when the readers of this book walk into a courthouse as potential jurors, they will remember that the system has to have balance or it fails. A major part of that balance is jurors, who will follow their oath to be fair and to listen to both sides before making a decision. If this book helps in having potential jurors think about that while they are serving on a jury, then I will consider it a success. Of course, if the book also sells 1,000,000 copies and I can finally afford a house on the beach, then I will also consider it as a success. I never claimed to be Atticus Finch.